Well, thank you. And Ajay, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Good. Well, listen, we need to talk about everything that has happened over the last 8 months or so. But before we do, I think it's important to recognize that Mastercard, for a long time, under your tenure, has been working to increase your participation in the global digital economy, really trying to work to expand access to those. So can you bring us up to speed to where you were as a company, maybe right when this pandemic hit in March of this year? What steps had you been taking to try to make the digital economy more inclusive for those customers around the world?
Yeah, so I mean, even before the pandemic, digital had become one of the ways to cut through the inability of the regular system to reach people. So, for example, in South Africa, when the South African government was trying to distribute social security payments to its citizenry, they used to do it through an old network of agents and physical cash being given to the agent. You had to show up, prove that you were you, get the money you were entitled to, and in the process, the agent was in a position of power and would very often charge a price for it. When you went back to this little room that the old lady was sharing with her nephew, the nephew would take his cut out of it, kind of thing. So the leakage, the difficulty for this person to get access to the money they wanted was enormous. That's got replaced some years ago by a biometric-enabled system where your voice, your fingerprints, your eyes were all recorded in equipment. And some of that was on a chip card. You could also do it by phone. You would just have to prove it was you, get your money from an ATM, no longer need to deal with an agent, and also, most importantly, no longer being carrying the money with you for your nephew to take away from you. And so it changed everything. It changed. You had an identity and you felt that you were in control of the money you were supposed to get, and you kicked out the leakage that was happening between the originating point of government and the recipient, the citizen. So examples like that abound, David. They abound from social security payments to how farmers were accessing information about crops to how small shopkeepers could get a loan, and all those examples abound.
Yeah, and then of course everything for all of us changed earlier this year. Talk to us about first the impact that the pandemic has had on the company as a whole, and then we can start talking about these specific examples and how consumer behavior might be changing. But just at a macro level, how is the company doing in the wake of the pandemic and all the economic disruption that has resulted?
Yeah, well, this has been truly a once in, I think, my lifetime kind of event. One thing it told you was that we were all interconnected. No matter how much you thought your borders were separate, there was no such thing. We were very deeply interconnected. So right at the beginning, we said we'd run our company for 4 stages. The first stage was containment. That was March, April, when everything was in kind of free fall around the world. Everything was shutting down. And then there was stabilization, which was the May, June period. And at the bottom, people were buying things, toilet paper, day-to-day items and useful, but at the bottom of the level. And then normalization, which is not really normal, it's a new normal. You're not having sporting events or theater or travel, but you are going out again and sitting outdoors and wearing masks and interacting in a certain way. And then the growth, which I think really depends on the free and full availability of vaccines, which is kind of the next stage that I think is towards, by the time it's fully available, sometime towards the middle or second half of next year. So we're kind of all going through that normalization phase. And you'll find that around the world in different places, consumer expenditure is climbed again. So the United States, for example, people are spending more than they were this time last year. Actually, plus the consumer spending is plus 2.5% or so over last year at this point of time. Now, what's missing there, that's a good tailwind for a company like ours because consumer spending is a fuel for our growth. A second thing that's growing well is all the items that surround digitization. So, we know that digital has had a huge boost in this period. So 7 out of 10 people are talking about the digital economy changing the way they will shop even in the future. 8 out of 10 people are doing contactless transactions. So, that changes how much cash you would use versus electronic forms of paying. And that's, again, a tailwind for our company. The third tailwind for our company is the use of data for cybersecurity, analytics in a digital world that has been enhanced many times over. And again, that which, data analytics and cybersecurity services are about a third of our revenue. That's received a boost as well. So these three are all tailwinds. The headwind is also real, and that's no cross-border travel. Even domestic travel is at a much lower level than it used to be. I mean, the TSA in the United States is clearing 1 million passengers a day right now. Pre-pandemic, it was 3.5 million. And at the peak of the problem back in March, April, it was 100,000. So there's some kind of a recovery there, but it's a lower recovery. And of course, there are no international travel corridors that are really open back to what used to be a very large amount of tourism, both personal tourism and business travel. So that's a pretty serious headwind. You put all that together, and that's what we're guiding our company through these, containment, stabilization, normalization, and growth phases.
That's very helpful. And I do want to look forward a bit here, because you mentioned some of the ways in which consumer behavior is already starting to change as a result of this pandemic. But I wonder, can you put a bit more meat on the bones there? Can you talk to us specifically, beyond just more contactless transactions? How else are we starting to see consumers pay for things differently, shop differently, and how might merchants be trying to receive their payments differently?
Like I said, the digital economy has changed everything. So if you have 7 out of 10 people saying that we plan to shop online even post the pandemic, that's a very real number. So to give you a specific example of the United States for a minute, pre-pandemic, retail sales, about 8 or 9% of all transactions, retail, used to be through e-commerce. In May, June, that number was running at 18%, double the number. Now, you could say that when June, July, August came about and some degree of physical commerce came back, that 18 dropped back to 15, 16, but it didn't go back to 8 or 9. So what that tells you is that the way people are shopping has changed. And this, by the way, cuts across age profiles, cuts across economic strata, cuts across everything. And so that's one big aspect. And merchants, in turn, have had to adapt very quickly, David, because if you were purely a physical merchant, this was not a great place for you to be. In the early days of the pandemic, in New York City, for example, close to 60% of merchants who had an electronic transaction in their store pre-pandemic had nothing, zero, for a month or two, which means they were basically closed with no revenue. That number is now running at about 25-30%. So a number of them have come back by becoming both physical and digital. So a lot of companies and governments are helping merchants get back into the digital space. And we at Mastercard launched something called Digital Doors, which in partnership with companies like Shopify allows merchants to try and find a way to go online, but also accept payments and find cyber tools. We're not the only ones. There are plenty of people doing this. So both from a consumer's point of view as well as from a merchant's point of view, this has changed, I think, a lot of things. If you look at economies where the pandemic is relatively under control, China, Hong Kong, Japan, parts of Australia, you will find that these trends that happened in the pandemic have rolled back somewhat, but they are well advanced digitally compared to where they were some time ago.
And I suspect that may also include how things are changing with the use of cash. You've been on sort of a crusade against cash, treating it as one of your main competitors for some years now. First, can you just explain to us the rationale behind that? Why do you consider cash truly a competitor?
Yeah, well, so you could either define your competitive space as other electronic payments, from digital wallets to other network providers and so on. Or you could look at the big space where consumers spend. And frankly, that's what we're in the business of, is to meet consumer needs. And 85% of consumer transactions a decade ago around the world used to be in cash. 15% were electronic. That number pre-pandemic was 80%. So we're still 80% cash driven. Some markets like the Nordics are more electronic than cash, and South Korea. But a lot of other markets, even the US, pre-pandemic used to be 50-50. Now, the pandemic's changed everything, right? Because people have gone contactless, gone e-commerce. But the fact is that cash was still king. way back when I joined 11 years ago at Mastercard. And so defining your market correctly was very much a part of focusing on what kind of tools, technologies, products, services will you develop to meet the needs of consumers and businesses who are still paying in relatively antiquated ways, and see if you can find a way to make that better. The second angle to this is that cash is not free. So cash costs money to print and secure and distribute. But it also is the way that you can, if you want to avoid taxes, it's with cash that facilitates that. Or cross-border illegal trade, all that happens with cash as the facilitator. So there's a cost of cash in society, which we were not pricing correctly. And then there's the whole issue that if you are left out of the economy with no identity, 2 billion people didn't have an identity. They didn't have bank accounts. Cash was the economy they operated in, which meant no way to save, no way to get credit at a reasonable price, no way to get insurance. And so exclusion is also something that cash sat on top of. And so to break through all these things for good commercial reasons, but also for getting into the right place, is what the idea was, to define cash as competition.
Yeah. Isn't there a flip side of it, though, where the move towards digital payments on such a widespread basis can also potentially keep people out of the digital economy? Those who don't have, just as you said, verified bank accounts, verified identities, they can have a much harder time operating in this system. How do you make sure, as we talk about inclusive digital economies, that just about everyone, be they in the United States or in a rural village in India or Africa, also has the opportunity to participate?
David, you're 100% correct. So remember, the idea here is not that you should go to zero cash. You have to allow people to choose. I started by consumer choice as being the factor. I just think 85-15 is the wrong ratio. But you asked a bigger question about digital and where that's going. And I think the digital divide is real. And you can see it in developed countries and developing countries. You can see it in anything from access to digital tools for education, to the availability of broadband, to a statistic which is that 250 million women around the world do not have access to the internet, even by an old phone, or let alone a computer or a tablet. And so there is a real issue with access and affordability across this. And I think we have to make enough effort that while we use this digitization effort to enable the democratization of access, you do it across all social strata and across all governments and all locations. And I think there are a series of things to be done. One of those clearly is the availability of broadband and infrastructure around broadband, which lots of countries are investing in. Another one has to do with the availability of, as I said, access to people to get involved with the internet, even through simple, cheaper devices. Again, a number of steps are being taken in that space. But a third one has to do with the fact that if you involve people with using the internet and getting familiar with it, education or what the internet could do is very important. I think getting people involved with the internet for citizenry is really critical. From accessing civil services to being able to vote, to be doing things of that nature will enable them to feel confident and comfortable about using the internet and using digital as a way of getting access to things. I think the pandemic actually, in a funny kind of way, has provided that impetus for this last part. On the other side of this is you've got to watch out for even guys like you and me who understand the internet. We are worried about privacy. We're worried about the use of our data. We're worried about the ethics of these. We're worried about cybersecurity. These are things that we have to tackle head on to ensure that people remain confident in the tools of what the internet can provide. The internet is an amazing access provider. It's done things for education. Just, when I was younger, to figure out what the Galapagos was, you had to have the Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, today, you can Google it. It doesn't cost anything, and you can get all the information you want about the Galapagos. One example. And that's just one way of explaining how the internet has transformed access for people. Yeah. It's a great tool.
Yeah.
We need to do it.
Mastercard, of course, Mastercard, of course, though, isn't an internet service provider or a hardware manufacturer, so there's only so much you can control there. What specific things is the company doing to try to aid in that transition so you do have that sort of democratization that you were talking about? Because try as you might, hope as you might, you alone are not going to be able to bring internet to all the people that don't have it just now. So where can the company itself make a difference on some of these issues?
Absolutely. So I think one of the first things is the absence of identities. If you don't have an identity, you cannot open accounts. If you cannot open accounts, you cannot access services of the type we're just discussing. In fact, for the Internet of Things, for the Internet of everything to become a reality, you've got to make it the Internet of everyone. And I think getting people to have an identity in a safe, secure way digitally is really important. So I gave you the starting point of our conversation was the example in South Africa of getting people to have the access through that identity. We're now developing digital identity tools that don't actually take your information and keep it with us. We leave it with your government, with your bank provider, with your phone provider, but we go and get only that piece of information that is needed to prove your identity for the purpose you want, your age or your address or whatever, and use that to demonstrate that this is you. I think we have to ensure that digital identity, a universal digital identity, is available. Very important, as one example, something we're working on. Similarly, data privacy. As I said, privacy of your data is really important. So we've put out data rules and principles out there. And the rules are, as a consumer, it's your data. You have a right to know what's being collected about you. You have a right to have it deleted if you so desire. You have a right to benefit from it. If I, as a company, collect your data, I should collect the minimum I need to do my job with you, and I should keep it safe. These are not difficult principles, and GDPR actually enshrines a number of these principles. And so these are the kind of things that companies like ours can subscribe to and help make a part of daily business conversation.
Good. Earlier this year, you announced this $250 million fund to support small businesses. Can you talk about why that was necessary at a moment like this, and what specifically that money will be used for?
David, I think small businesses are the backbone of all our economies. They are more than 50% of GDP. They are an overwhelming majority of employment. And you can see that during the pandemic, the biggest impact is on small businesses, service industries, and that creates disproportionality in those who are impacted. So I think focusing on them and making sure that we can make them successful through this coming period of challenge is really important. And one of the things we're trying to do with the $250 million is to focus on allowing those who are physical only to also go online. So we launched something called Digital Doors, which is in partnership with organizations like Shopify. We enable people to create their website, put their products online, and then through our payments technology, we enable them to start accepting payments. And then through our cybersecurity and data privacy tools, we give them access to the tools to manage that. And so it's like a whole soup to nuts kind of thing to enable them to deal with this coming world of digital technology. So a number of those tools are actually oriented towards women-oriented business. So there's an organization called Hello Alice, which is very driven towards that. There are others of that type that enable networking and tools to go online and be safe online as well as accept payments online. That's just one set of examples.
That's great. You mentioned just how critical small businesses are, and I think that's something we all know at a visceral level, but you really have insight into the data, given your view into consumer behavior, transaction trends. As you look at the economy right now, certainly in the US, but perhaps also in Europe, where the surge is also back, what areas of the economy are you most concerned about as we head into the winter right now?
Yeah, well, I think the hospitality sector, airlines, travel, everything to do with that deeply concerns me, because they, at the end of the day, their lifeblood is travel. And while they're doing better because domestic travel has revived to some extent, even in the US and in Europe, intra-Europe travel. but the shutting down again is hurting that. And so then there are all the ancillary industries from there. The zip line provider in Hawaii, who employs 7 people, is clearly going through a very challenging time. It's a great business. The person probably employs people and pays them fairly, but today is challenged by an absence of a revenue model. That's why a lot of the stimulus packages that governments put together were aimed at these small businesses and these more affected sectors of the economy. I think the other part is restaurants. They sort of revived a little bit between June, July, August, when outdoor dining was permitted, and then progressively a certain level of indoor dining, 25% in New York, 50% elsewhere, a different number in Europe. I think you can see that's rolled back as well through a series of restrictions. So you can find that to be an impacted sector as well. So retail on the whole is in a different place. I mean, I think that both online and physical retail has had an opportunity to come back into the real world over the last few months. But I do worry about everything to do with travel, hospitality, and the service industry, theater, entertainment, that kind of space.
Yeah, so that's the areas of concern. Though, as you mentioned, some economies, of course, are on the other side of this, at least for now. We can look to China, to Hong Kong, to South Korea, to New Zealand. When you look at those economies, and you mentioned this a bit earlier, but I'd love to hear it in a bit more detail, what kind of consumer behavior are you seeing, both in terms of spending patterns, but also how people are spending money? Is cash back to where it was before? Is e-commerce sustaining its growth? What does the economy look like on the other side of COVID for all of us? I think we are desperate to know.
Yeah, well, I hope those economies stay out of COVID and don't have slipbacks, because those 4 stages we talked about, David, they were not linear. And you can see Europe and the US kind of headed wrong direction right now. And at a point of time, Japan and Singapore were headed in that direction, as was the Melbourne area in Australia. They all seem to have come out of it pretty well right now, and I hope they stay that way. What you are seeing in behavior there is that digital is certainly here to stay, but it is at a lower level than the peak of the pandemic, because human beings want to get out. They want to socialize. They want to be back in physical spaces. They want to travel. They want to be in restaurants. They want to be in a Disney theme park. It's what we want. We are social beings. And they're back in office. So if you look at office attendance in those markets, a number of them, office attendance is back close to 80-90%. And that changes the way that small businesses and office complexes are again back to life, because your hot dog vendor, your coffee guy, the shops in that office complex are all suffering right now. So in those markets, they're coming back to where they used to be. So consumer behavior is showing that they have embraced digitization, but they're at a more balanced level than what they were at the peak of the pandemic, but they're well above what they used to be prior to the pandemic. That's pretty clear. Cross-border travel is still not back. So some corridors have reopened. China, Hong Kong obviously is a corridor that's open, but there are also corridors opening, and there's conversations going on between Singapore and countries in Southeast Asia, Australia, and Japan. And as those corridors begin to reopen, maybe with some kind of a health passport or a COVID test pre and post, even before vaccines are fully available, I think you will begin to see probably personal travel recover before corporate and business travel. That we have seen is the change in domestic travel as well. Wherever domestic travel is recovered, like in China, it has recovered with personal travel before corporate and business travel.
Got it. So Ajay, it's been 10 years now that you've been at the company, and earlier this year it was announced, just before the worst of COVID really began to hit, that you would be stepping down at the end of this year. As you look ahead, where do you believe this company will be 10 years from now? How will payments be different? Where will cash be? Give us a preview 10 years out of what you expect Mastercard to be doing 10 years from now.
Yeah, well, I don't know about 10 years. This is an industry where change is the only constant. And I think that's a good thing, because there's so much innovation and so much competition in the sector from everybody who's trying to figure out ways to make the sector more efficient, which is good. I do know this, that in my view, two or three things will happen. One is I believe that while e-commerce will keep growing and omni-channel experiences will become really important, we will search online, shop in store, or try out in store and shop online, and return in store, return online. That's one obvious one. And we want that to be safe, simple, and smart. But I think the Internet of Things will change everything, because every device would become a device of information and commerce. So if your car, your sunglasses, your toaster, your doorbell, and everything is connected through the internet, I think that changes everything. I think machine-to-machine transactions of small numbers using a lot of AI will also come into being. I think you have to be ready for that. And finally, I think augmented reality and virtual reality will change the shopping experience for people. You would be able to try out that pair of sneakers or that jacket and see how it looks on your virtual avatar in very different ways from what you can do today. So I think there's a very exciting possibility, both in terms of the democratization of information access and therefore pricing and the like, but also the shopping experiences and the travel experiences and the experiences that people will get as a result of this technology over the next 10 years. I expect Mastercard, with my successor, Michael, who becomes CEO when I become exec chair on 1st of Jan, I expect him to be very much around for this decade and very much helping to drive that change, as we have been doing for the past decade.
Thanks. And then just lastly, Ajay, we're of course speaking on a day when, at least in the US, the markets were absolutely through the roof on news, partly of the virus, but also of the election results, which were declared here over the weekend in the United States. How do you believe that the Joe Biden presidency will affect not necessarily the markets, because I know we can't entirely predict that, but the economy? How will trade, how will economic policy, and how will that trickle down to the businesses who are your customers evolve and be different under a President Biden than it was under a President Trump?
Well, I think if you go by what his public pronouncements have been thus far, because that's kind of what you have to work with, both during the campaign as well as with the speech that he made when he was announced as president-elect, which he and his vice president-elect made. I think you'll find there are a few clear signs of difference. And the first one is he clearly wants to re-engage with the global model. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to just turn the clock back and say, let's go back to what it was like earlier. I think some things have changed. One of those clearly is a desire to create a level playing field for American industry and American businesses in many countries around the world. But I suspect that he will engage with multilateral systems. He will engage with our allies in a manner to take them along on that journey. I think there are many things he needs to work on that global trade front. But even before that, you're going to see a very strong engagement. In fact, he's already announced his coronavirus task force. That really is mission 1, 2, and 3. We have to get back on our feet on health, on this virus, on vaccine, on the things we can do. We're getting 126,000 cases a day or two ago in the US. That is unsustainable. We've got to turn that tide. And if countries in Asia can do it, there is no reason why the United States cannot do it. We have to get it done. And if you get that done,
as well,
and you focus on the domestic economy, and you focus on inequality and the K-shaped recovery, I think you're going to find a President Biden focusing on these topics while engaging with the outside world in a constructive way, but with an effort to get American industry and American business a chance to have a level playing field wherever we have to go. And honestly, that's all good.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ajay, very much for your time here.
Thanks a lot, David. Nice to see you.